I've had so many beginner gouache artists tell me that they're trying to achieve the kind of gouache results that they see other artists online achieving, and they're just not able to get there, and they just can't figure out what exactly they're doing wrong. If that's something that you relate to, then keep watching because this video is for you. Hey, welcome back to the channel, and if you're new here, welcome to the channel. My name is Shivani and I'm an artist and creative entrepreneur based in the sunny city of Chennai in the south of India. I've been working with gouache for almost 3 years now, almost every single day. So I've made my fair share of mistakes while I started working with the medium, and I completely know what it's like to get frustrated because you're not getting the results that you want to. So let's not waste any more time. Let's jump straight into the top mistakes that I think that you might be making and how to avoid them. One of the great things about gouache is that it's a medium that you can create layers with. But I find that most beginner artists tend to struggle with layering. So that brings me to the first mistake and tip that I have for you, which is regarding creating layers. What you'll find is that if you try to go in over wet paint with a layer, you will not be able to layer it. You see how it's blending here into the base layer? That's because the base is still wet. So let's see how to tackle that. I'm going to paint another swatch right here. And in case you're wondering, this color that I'm using is Winsor & Newton Designer's Gouache Cypress Green. This time I'm going to wait for that swatch to completely dry before we move on. Until then, I'm just going to paint one more swatch right here. So I've got 3 dry swatches of paint here. Now the next mistake you could potentially make with layering is overworking the paint. So let's say I want to add a layer here. I'm pressing down my brush a lot and going over it multiple times, and you see how that's reactivating the base layer. So that's what I mean by overworking the paint, and you don't want to be doing that. Another layering mistake that people make is keeping their layer of paint too watery. So here I have very watery paint, and as you can see, it's not forming a proper layer. The right way to layer your paint with gouache is to keep your paint of the right consistency. It should be perfectly creamy, not too thick and not too thin. And you don't want to overwork it so that you don't reactivate your base layer. So here my paint is of a nice creamy consistency. I'm picking up a good amount of it on the brush, and then I'm just laying down the paint without going over it multiple times. This is the way to get a nice opaque and smooth layer without hints of the base color peeping through or without them blending together. So let's discuss consistency so that you can get that right. When it comes to gouache, the perfect consistency of paint is one that's smooth and creamy and kind of like melted ice cream. So as you can see here, it's nice and creamy on my palette. It doesn't feel too thick or too thin. And let's paint that and see how it looks. There. It's perfectly creamy and opaque, and you don't see any of the paper coming through the paint. And it's very easy for me to move my brush around on the paper. The first mistake is keeping your paint way too watery, so it ends up looking kind of like watercolor. Now that's something you don't want, because you want it to be nice and creamy like this. You can intentionally sometimes use it like watercolor to create background washes and things like that. So here I'm using it watery but intentionally. But most of your illustrations with gouache would be done with this smooth and creamy consistency. The other mistake is keeping your paint too dry. So let's say there wasn't enough moisture on your brush and you're trying to pick up your paint, but you've just not got enough paint, you've not got enough water, and it's too dry. You'll see that you get dry brush strokes like this. Again, this is something that can be used intentionally. Dry brushing is a great shading technique with gouache, but most of the time you're going to want your brush to move smoothly on the paper, and you won't be able to do that when your brush and your paint is too dry. Another common mistake that people make when they're working with gouache is not mixing up enough paint on the palette. So let's say I want to paint this circle right here. And of course, this is very simple. Usually you would do an entire page, a more complex illustration, and you might want to use the same color multiple times across your illustration. As you get familiar with the medium, you'll learn to understand color mixing and exactly how much paint you need to cover the entire area. But when you're starting off as a beginner, I would say that mixing more is better than mixing less. So let's say I wanted to paint that, and especially artists who are used to watercolor might be used to mixing lesser quantities of paint or easily being able to mix the same color again. But with gouache, it's very hard to mix the exact same color again. So let's say I mixed up this much paint and I want to cover that circle. Because you're using gouache nice and thick and creamy, you'll realize very soon that this is not at all enough paint to cover this entire illustration. I'm already running out of paint, and the most common thing that people would do in such a case is add more water, which dilutes the paint, and then try to sort of bring that in, but that would make your illustration look quite terrible once it's dry, because you're going to have one side that's a lot more watery than the other side. So you can see that happening here, because I did not mix up enough paint on my palette. I ran out of paint and then I tried to make up for it by adding more water, but that's not going to give you a nice, smooth and consistent opaque finish. So let's try it once again. This time I'm going to mix up a lot more paint, because I've realized that how much I first mixed is not enough. I'm going to add the right amount of water to make it nice and creamy, so it's sticking to my brush, not just falling off my brush. If it's falling off your brush, you'd know that it's a bit too watery. Now I think this is going to be enough, so I'm going to paint another circle right here. You want to have enough paint for you to generously apply it across your paper. So this time I can already tell that I've definitely mixed up enough paint. I'm getting a nice consistent application across my entire illustration, and I'm happy with that. And as you can see, I have some leftover paint on my palette as well. My tip for you would be to let that dry. I often use my palette multiple times when I'm working with gouache. Allow that to dry on your palette. It's completely fine as long as you're using good quality gouache like Winsor & Newton Designer's gouache. You'll easily be able to reactivate that on your palette even after it's dry. So I often, like what I did for this whole tutorial, I'll come back to my palette, I'll mix in other colors into existing colors, like I might add some white in here and reactivate the pink that's already there, and it'll come back to that smooth and creamy consistency. Another mistake that people often make is not swatching their colors before they put it into their final painting. Gouache is a medium which is a little tricky because it dries different from how it appears when it's wet. This is a great demonstration right here. If you can see this color, I'm wetting it here. On the other side, it's already dry, and as you can see, the dry color looks a lot darker than this portion which is wet. You'll see the same thing happen when I put it on paper. So once you mix up a color, keep in mind you wouldn't have seen what it looks like when it's dry. So once you put it on the paper, you may think that it looks really light, and maybe that's what you're going after, but then you find that once it dries, it's a lot darker than what you were expecting it. Now the reason for that is that with gouache, dark colors dry lighter and light colors dry darker. Like I demonstrated to you in the palette there, let's look at a dark color. So there's not enough paint there, so I'm just going to take some black. You'll find that with the dark color, it appears a lot darker than how it dries up looking. As it's drying, you can see that the color appears a lot lighter, and this one, the color appears darker. And just to demonstrate once again, I'll place a bit of the wet paint beside it, and you can see the wet paint looks so much lighter for the light color, and with the dark color, the wet paint looks so much darker than it actually ends up looking once it's dry. So that's something to keep in mind with gouache. Make sure you swatch your colors. I always keep waste pieces of paper beside me when I'm painting, and I make sure I keep swatching. Like you can see here, I would have swatched that. I realized it's not as light as what I wanted, and then I adjust the color before I put it into my actual painting so that I don't have the hassle of correcting it later. And the final mistake that a lot of beginner gouache artists make is not understanding the different pigments and how they interact with each other. You need to get really good at color mixing for you to be able to mix an entire spectrum of colors with just a limited palette. For the longest time, I just owned my 3 primary colors along with black and white, and I was able to mix so much with them. I didn't really need any additional colors. I only added on colors about 2 years into my gouache journey when I knew exactly what I wanted to add to my palette. So understanding color becomes a very important part of your journey as an artist. And if that's something you're interested in doing, I have an amazing mini course that's releasing in just a week's time. So subscribe to my channel to stay updated on that, and you can even sign up to my mailing list via the link in the description to stay updated as soon as it comes out. Once it's out, I'll also be adding the link to that mini course in the description of this video. So be sure to check it out. So if you follow all of these tips and pointers that I shared with you about painting with gouache, you'll definitely get a lot more confident with the medium and a lot more comfortable working with it. As you get comfortable, you'll feel less intimidated by it, and you can explore a lot with it. It's one of my favorite mediums to work with. If you want to know more about painting with gouache as a beginner, be sure to check out my Gouache Painter's Handbook. The link to it is in the description below. You will find a lot of value in it because I answer all the top questions that I get asked about working with gouache, including the papers, the brushes, how to work with the paint, how to layer it, and even what colors to select for your palette as a beginner. Aside from that, if you're looking for more video content to learn from, be sure to check out my entire gouache playlist. It has videos on every topic to do with gouache. I collect all of my videos in that playlist. It's a one-stop destination where you can find all of it in one place. So go ahead, click here, check that out, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.